Good afternoon, sir.
Hello.
Tell me who you are.
Robin Heath.
And what brings you to shiny Megalithomania?
Well, the first day of summer today, but I come to Megalithomania because I'm a full-time researcher into megalithic matters. I've been doing that for 20 years.
Would you say you are a megalithomaniac?
No, it's a dangerous word, maniac, but you know, it's been a very important part of my last 20 years. And
talk to me a little bit about your speciality, your passion within the field.
Yeah, passion was really fired up when I suppose I went to see Alexander Thom lecture in the 60s at the university, and this quiet and rather difficult to understand with the Scottish accent guy sort of blew me a bit away with what he'd found out about stone circles and their geometry and their astronomy and their metrology. These three things: metrology, that's units of length being used. He was an engineer, not an archaeologist. So he asked the very basic question: are these devils using a unit of length? It's a very reasonable thing. Is it used widely? Is it the same one in every site? You know, and he did this amazing self-funded research program.
Wow.
For years, 30 odd years. Then he wrote a book about it, and the archaeologists just went ape. At that point, it was just obvious that he and they were going to be in conflict. He couldn't understand why, because he was a top academic and an engineer. So he had what everybody wants, which is he's got the head and he's also got the practical skills. And so I went to listen to this lecture, and then, like as you do, life moved on. I got married, but I kept this sort of bubbling away because megaliths had featured a bit in my childhood. I lived in the Peak District where there are many, and my father didn't know much about them. Now there's a point, isn't it? When your dad proves not to know everything, that's when you begin to become an adult.
Absolutely.
And so there were some questions like, how old are they? And I picked it up again in the 80s and went to live in Wales very soon after, where I've been ever since, and France. Very fascinating time.
So talk to me a little bit about Wales, because obviously most people know about Stonehenge, they know a little about Avebury, they know about some of the lesser known ones, some of the stuff in Brittany and Carnac.
Yeah.
Talk to me about some of the megalithic sites in Wales.
Well, the one everybody sees, and it's on the National Park brochure, is Pentrefan, which is the big chambered tomb. So it's a very impressive and very elegant site. What Wales hasn't got is a very closely packed set of stone circles anywhere. They're dotted fairly evenly throughout Wales, but in the area where I live, there's an awful lot of dolmens that are very, very important. They're very important for many reasons, not all of them to do with my work, but they have provided some of the archaeological evidence to support the pushing back of the age of these things, which I'm making a very presumptuous guess of your age now, but in our lifetime, they've been pushed back from sort of 1800 BC to perhaps further back than 4000 BC, some of them, particularly in Brittany, where there are dolmens that are dated well accurately at 4800 BC. So that we've got a concentration near where we live of those, and there's standing stones everywhere all over Wales. There's plenty of those. But the archaeologists have never really had a grip on them. So Wales has never really, in my view, been explored from an archaeoastronomy point of view. So I'm doing sort of Alexander Thom's, the bits he would have done if he'd spent more time in Wales, I'm trying to mop up. And that's been thrilling.
And are you finding that these archaeoastronomical alignments, are they connected not only with the stars but with each other, these other sites? Do they correspond?
Well, joining up the dots has been a very major part of my recent work, particularly in Brittany as well. Most of these dolmens are doing the same thing astronomically. They're aligned to key sun and moon positions. They can be detected, corrected for the change in the Earth's tilt, calculated. This is all sort of the routine stuff that archaeologists do when everyone's watching telly. And the outcome of it is that they all respond very... You know, and over the years, I've been there on the right day and taken the right photo at the right time, and it's pretty hard to argue with that when you've actually, it's not any longer a theoretical idea, you've got the picture. Some of them talk to mountains in Ireland, which is 93 miles away, which are visible occasionally, just occasionally. So some of the alignments are also, in addition to the sun setting there, are going into the highest mountain top in Wicklow or Leinster, or or North Wales. It's to the mountains of Mourne and those northern Irish mountains, and of course it's like Aladdin's cave, because no one's done this work. No one's actually, because archaeology hasn't been asking these questions. It's been asking a different set of questions, perfectly valid, but they don't address the question of astronomy or metrology or geometry. And I think this is the missing component. Well, I'm not the first person to say that.
No, I would agree entirely.
Yeah,
entirely. I mean, the big question, I suppose, then is why? If you have a proven correlation to archaeoastronomical phenomena, why?
Well, it's quite clear. It is to me, anyway. There comes a point where it's almost boring to find yet another site that's doing the same thing. I've reached that point now with many sites. I don't mean the work is boring, but it's not feeding me with the answer to your question. This is something that needs you stand back from, and you look at your work and other people's work, and you say, well, what was the overall driver for this? Why would you build a dolmen whose axis of symmetry is on the midsummer sunset? Or a moonrise at the extreme 18-year cycle. The conclusion I've come to is that these guys actually did have a form of number intelligence which wouldn't be like our mathematics, but they could certainly count. And they were recording these long cycles and comparing the moon cycle with, say, the length of the year, which they knew 2 hours, and the length of the lunar month, which they knew 2 hours. And I think Alexander Thom was quite right when he said on the not the Horizon, the Chronicle documentary, when he said these devils were, I keep wanting to say buggers, but I'm on camera, so got to be careful. And also Americans don't like that word. But these devils, they were monitoring the top of the thing was the prediction of eclipses, and then you've got to ask, well, why were they so important? I think we were dealing with a culture that had discovered something else that really is very much not acceptable in archaeology, which is, I think, they discovered in the numbers that they were getting mathematical correlations that blew them away, as it blew me away. Because I think some of my work has been the rediscovery of those, such as the whole of the Sun, Moon, Earth system can be described by a 5, 12, 13 triangle. You can do everything with a piece of rope. If you make a 5, 12, 13 triangle with it, you can predict the next eclipse for years. You can predict how the moons are going to fall on what date. You can even do tidal work with it. And that is just a minor miracle that the cosmos is structured that way.
Very much so.
John Michel was just at the end of his life starting to warm to this as a new development in his own work, that the idea that a piece of geometry could hold the key to local astronomy in local space around the Earth is actually telling us something about the way time and space are structured. And that then moves into the area of physics and philosophy.
And metaphysics.
And metaphysics, yes, that's right. Yeah, you're doing my lines.
and given that there are such commonalities as well with sites all over the globe, would you say then that we are looking at the magnificence of man, if you like, independently discovering these things and developing them? Or would you say it's more a case of a common parent culture, the vestiges of still?
Well, I've changed my mind on that a few times, but recent work, I was introduced to the sites in Brittany again. I lived in Brittany for 2 years, near Carnac, in the early 90s. But subsequently, I've learnt French and I've met Howard Crowhurst, who you've probably interviewed. And Howard and I have done work together in both in this country and there, and we sort of get on quite regularly, but infrequently. When we get on, it's quite intense, and we meet. But the sites in Brittany are amazing because they confirm something, and they've helped with understanding the sites in Britain, because there are sites there that have not been disturbed, that are contiguous stone shapes with the stones all touching, and there's not hardly any gaps, and you can obviously see that it was once. And these stones seem, first of all, they've convinced me that they were counting days in a unit almost negligibly different from our present inch.
Interesting.
And the meter crops up all over the place.
And that's the fascinating one. I had the privilege of interviewing Alan Butler last year,
Yeah.
Who's done some work very recently on the metrology.
Yeah.
And what surprised me particularly from what he presented in his work is the apparently ancient origins of the metric system.
Yes.
I was amazed
Yeah.
by that, because obviously we're given to understand it's essentially Napoleonic, and it's
Yes.
from that, where it seems that...
No, there's some mysteries about this. I mean, Howard Crowhurst has told us this story that Napoleon was a Breton.
Good Lord, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know, but I mean, he's pretty good on those things.
That's interesting.
But the interesting thing we found at Lemanio in Brittany, this quadrilateral shape, which my brother and I, we can give you the website.
Please.
Well, it's www.skyandlandscape.com. That's easy, isn't it? Am I allowed to advertise? Not the BBC, is
Certainly
it?
not, no.
So we discovered there that the representation, by accident, we didn't look for this, but by accident it turns out that if you take the value of the metre, 3/4 of that, value of the metre, is the length of the lunar month.
Good.
So 9 lunar months 9 metres represents a lunar year, exactly. And therefore there's a correlation between the metre. I mean, it can be a coincidence, but the point is it is there in the monument to be found. If you assume you're counting in day inches, and an inch represents a day, there's your link between the old system and the new.
So, wow.
Yeah, and, but we didn't look for that, and it was an unexpected joy to find it. And of course, I was working then at the time when my dear friend and departed friend John Michel was still alive, who was vehemently sort of anti the metric system. Mm-hmm. And he was right in many ways, but maybe things are now moving to a new understanding of a common ancestor, which answers your question about what was going on with human beings. These sites are 4,000 BC, older than that, so they're really not quite where we would have put the Neolithic years ago.
Well, again, I mean, this comes on to very neatly leads into something else I wanted to ask you, which is that why is it that we have traditionally been told that these monuments are a particular age, most commonly much, much younger, if you like, than now seems to be the case? What? Well,
I think to do that you have to study the mindset of archaeology in the Gordon Child era, and Jacquetta Hawkes and Stuart Piggott and all those wonderful those colossally larger than life, Mortimer Wheeler, they're magnificent people. And the fact is that their reputations, they could not have classical Greece being pipped. Pythagorean triangles is the classic, isn't it? I mean, Jacquetta Hawkes practically wet herself on mainstream television because she could not accept that Alexander Thom was finding 3, 4, 5 triangles, and she said, in her wonderful sort of "I smoke 40 fags a day" voice, she was saying, and it seems quite remarkable that they were doing these things. In fact, it's incredible that we're doing these things 2,500 years before ancient Greece. When they first did these things, and it's sort of like they could not see it.
Well, of course, the mainstay, the foundation of classical education was classical education. The Greeks invented pretty much everything, and what they didn't.
Well, of course. Ewan Mackay he was an archaeologist. He used to run the Hunterian Museum as a curator. Mm-hmm. He didn't get his professorship because he stood up for Alexander Thom.
Oh, really?
But he said that it's quite obvious. This is a quote from him, badly quoted, I have to say. It's quite obvious that archaeologists, there was something in the training of archaeologists that meant that they could not deal with the discoveries of Alexander Thom.
So, Robin, let's talk for a second about traditional and mainstream archaeology and academia. Why do you think that they find it so hard to incorporate new views and new information?
It stunned me. I was an engineer for years in semiconductors. And half of everything you believed about semiconductors changed every 6 months in the 70s. The problem was you didn't know which half. The successful companies are the ones that knew which half. And the rest went to the wall. The way of making these little chip things that are in everything now was quite difficult. Now, archaeology seems to me to have an inherent inertia. Like all academic subjects, there's a PhD time lapse where your pride is invested in this thing that you made your name on when you were a young buck or a young buckess. And, you know, and the training, I mean, the Ewan Mackay thing, I've already given you that quote. But, you know, there's telltales from some of the most famous archaeologists of the last century. Richard Atkinson went to visit Alexander Thom and stay with him in Dunlop. They were good friends, and he went up there because he wanted to master some of this knowledge that he said we had to take seriously. And he spoke to Tom's daughter and granddaughter over breakfast and said, the problem with me is I'm a 1, 2, 3 lots man. He said, I can't do anything with numbers. And Glyn Daniel said something like this in one of his editorials slamming Tom. Stuart Piggott wasn't a numbers man, wonderful draftsman and great researcher. So really what I'm saying is that the education of archaeologists needs to include this component, because I think the astronomy, the geometry and the metrology are actually holistically all seamless within the monuments. They do it all.
I think you're right. I think
Yeah.
Holistic is exactly the right
Yeah,
way
and
to
I mean,
use
you
it.
look at the stonework all over the world where these got these irregular, homogeneous structures that are earthquake-proof, and I mean, they are very strange that they crop up all over the world. And my final point is that I think that archaeologists have genuinely, in their worst nightmares, which we figure in, you know, there's a lunatic fringe, we figure in their worst nightmares, but then their worst nightmares, they know underneath that they haven't been able to pace the change of pushing back the dating in their own professional lives. But I mean, get over it, you know, there's some new information here. And radiocarbon dating does not date stone.
No, it doesn't.
And so therefore we could look for more of that.
Well, indeed. I mean, I've interviewed, spent some time with Michael Tellinger and also obviously Robert Temple, both of whom who are looking at some very cutting-edge ways of dating stone, whether or not they turn out to be
Using rare elements and things, yes.
That's right. I mean,
Yeah.
Tellinger's looking at a very specific form of lichen growth, which seems to have weight, and Robert Temple's looking at sonoluminescence, various ways of looking at stone. But all of these are pushing back the dates quite considerably, and I think it's realistic to assume that most of these persisting or still existing ancient sites that we find are probably a lot older than we need to understand.
You see, I think that archaeoastronomy has a lot to offer there, because
I agree
the
too.
Earth's tilt change gives you some, not a very accurate, but it does allow you to pinpoint if you're right in your assumption that the sun or the moon or Venus did set at that point on the horizon from the monument, or its symmetries are aligned to it, then that you can date within a few hundred years when the site was conceived of.
Absolutely.
Now, assuming that you haven't, then any further development of that site would be a later and would post-date it. But you know that the site was set up then.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if the stones are the original stones, you've got a date for them. Now, I think that that's something that Robert Temple and this Tellinger, is it?
Mike Tellinger.
Yeah, that they might find quite useful at some stage. I'm not sure where archaeoastronomy now goes, because I think these number coincidences lead, and you rightly said, into an area, and I pause, but you put the word in, metaphysics, because I think that the ancient people may well have been finding these number correspondences, predicting eclipses. It gives you an idea that you're actually able to communicate with the gods, or however you perceive what they are. I mean, if you can predict an eclipse, it also gives you power, as Alexander Thom was well aware of. Now, that didn't cut with the archaeology of the 20s, and there were a lot of Marxists and communists in the archaeology movement, and they didn't like the idea of an elite.
No room for God either.
No room for God. Yeah, I was coming to that. You're on the ball. Ewan Mackay, you see, spent a lot of his early career at Durrington Walls and various other sites, Belize and various other sites, recognising that the elite lived in separate buildings from other people, and they were close to the big sites that he said were where the astronomy was going on. Like Avebury has got the sanctuary, Stonehenge got Durrington Walls, and we've got sites in Wales, and I'll pronounce them in Wales and no one will understand what I'm saying. But the point is that this is a common factor. And the cuts of meat and the type of pottery and various other things that an archaeologist is well qualified to identify, said that there was a different class system operating in these places.
The priest class, the keepers of the knowledge.
Yeah, the astronomer priests, call them what you will.
Yeah.
And they knew these Pythagorean triangles, they knew how to work this astronomy, how to use ropes to predict eclipses and all of that. And they made beautiful objects in the soil with stone. But that's totally not where our culture is at the moment, mentioning metaphysics, and it should be really, because there's the evidence of it.
I agree entirely. I mean, I've noticed, personally speaking, I've been going to ancient sites, particularly Avebury, as a regular pilgrim, if you like, for probably 12 or 15 years now. And I can remember when I used to go back in the early days, and I would go for not just the fun and sun ones, I would go for Samhain, I would go for winter solstice, and there'd be maybe 3 people and a dog there. You go today, Samhain gathering at the sanctuary can draw 300-400 people now. Why do you think so many more people are being drawn to these sites now?
In a word, meaning, I think, because there's not much meaning in a lot of modern things, and so meaning, it anchors people to something solid and real. It's like a ship's anchor, it keeps people grounded. It's the same where I live. I mean, there were sites that I never saw anyone at, and since I've written the book about them, the people actually go there, and you see, it gives you it's quite chuffing that in their pocket is stuffed a wrinkly and dirty, scruffy copy of your book, and you know it's been used, and that's exactly what a book should be. But I think it's meaning, and this happened with the lay movement in the 70s. It was much the same then. There was a primal sort of cultural leap to look at the old traditions, farming. You know, people looked at old methods of farming. The self-sufficiency movement was essentially look backwards in a lot of things, the good old days. And indeed, many of the things were not good old days, but they were simpler, and they had more meaning, and survival depended on being able to be competent in certain skills. And so it's perhaps a reaction partly to the sort of mechanised world, the automatic world we live in.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And just to, you touched on being an engineer for many for many years. Let's just talk for a moment about the how. How do you go about building a Stonehenge, or a Giza pyramid, or a Tiwanaku, or a White Pyramid?
Well, the problem there I have is that the sources of information are very mixed about how long it took to build, how big the average length piece of stone. I can't go out there and measure a pyramid. What I can do is look at a local dolmen, and the simple answer to your question is, I have to look you in the eye and say, I don't know. That's not something that has fallen to my research in any degree. It could be that I can quite see, because I've taken part in moving a 4-ton stone, with people, and that's not too tricky to move it on the flat. If you've got fairly solid ground, if it's wet, which it is in Wales, often you can't. And of course, we're never going to find, if they were building cranes or shear legs out of wood, we're never going to find those, are we, in the acid soils of Britain? But I'm surprised we haven't found them, or more evidence of the tools, and this applies to the stone cutting stuff too, within the Egyptian culture or the South American cultures. That surprises me. I wonder if the artifacts that archaeologists find, they don't identify other than as ritual objects, and nobody would recognise an internal chisel because it doesn't fit the remit.
Indeed. I mean, I spent a little bit of time in South America last year. I've been out to Egypt before, and we are still given to understand that the reigning paradigm is that the artefacts of ancient Egypt were constructed using nothing more complex than
copper chisels and a maul and a hammer. Yeah.
I've looked at it and I really can't see it.
There are. One of the things that shook me up on Egypt, because it wasn't really, I'm not a globetrotter. I do believe that you can spread your fire site hopping. I mean, that's personal. People can do what they like, it's their money. But I've had to concentrate on France, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, because it's my compass. I can get there. It's cheap. It's all self-funded, so I have to be careful how much allocation of time I can give to these things. But I've got the opinion that we've got in the stage where the evidence is so, coincidences have stopped being coincidences anymore. And I think that we need to relook at some of the bottom drawers in some museums for tooling and methods of tooling. And we need to try and replicate the way in which stone is cut I think archaeologists there may be some really good breakthroughs if they would just accept that. We've had quite a few people deliberately blocking work in that area. One very famous gentleman in Egypt until recently, blocking sort of any outright novel, radical research into that subject.
One could be forgiven for thinking that it's less about discovery than it is about reinforcing an existing paradigm.
But that's the PhD protection organisation, isn't it? But there's some books which were written in Victorian times about what they found then in Egypt, because we think it's all Howard Carter and the 20s, but there was a big thing with Napoleon and the Champollion and the stone and the Rosetta and Dender and all of that. And the Victorians were very fond of that, and this 2-volume set of books about Egypt. And one of the things in there just blew me away, because I come from the north of England, as you probably can slightly detect, was that they had a process for doing cloth, which in the cotton trade was called Jeffreying, which is, good job it wasn't called Roger, isn't it? which is where the finer, you can make really fine, how many threads per inch can you get up on a loom and weave. And it was something phenomenal was happening in Egypt. They found evidence of cloth with something like 380 threads per inch.
Good God.
And pleated, this is the Jeffreying bit, where they pleat it so that it remains a permanent pleated garment.
Wow.
And with that fine. And I read this book and I thought, well, this doesn't fit any of the modern books I read about Egyptology.
No.
And so I suspect, and it's not my area, someone else will have to answer these questions, but I suspect that when we come to ancient Egypt, there's an awful lot of stuff gathering dust that could tell us a great deal. And Robert Temple would with the lenses thing, the glass lenses, has had a field day, hasn't he, with that stuff?
He certainly has.
Yeah. Crystal Sun contains photographs of many things described as ritual objects, which seems fairly obviously were used for some optical purpose, if not a telescope.
No, I agree entirely. Just to round up then, we've talked a little bit about the various sites from all over the world, your speciality being these British Isles, and looking at the...
I'm Brittany.
The monoliths,
I like Brittany
Megaliths.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps you could say Celtic Britain.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Celtic
Western
lands.
Europe, really, northwestern Europe.
Do you see it as a legacy or a development? Do you think we are looking at the remnants of a lost civilization that remain, or do you see it as an independently developed rise of culture?
Well, if you're a mathematician, you realise that if you get a clean sheet of paper and a pencil and start playing with numbers, you're going to arrive at key numbers eventually. Pi, phi, the golden number. Am I using the right words here? Golden Schnitt, if you're German. And you're going to arrive at those. When a consciousness reaches a certain level with numbers, people are going to discover. They're going to know that that pentagram around your neck is actually to do with phi, and it's actually to do with 3 to 2 or whatever, however coarsely it's perceived, and that there's 72 degrees, however you define what there is in a circle, it's a fifth of it, and that's all going to be, wherever you are, you're going to eventually, at a certain level of consciousness, are going to be able to synthesize that stuff. So it could be both. It could be that knowledge was lost and then recovered eventually. We are told that all human beings came from 12 women that happened to walk up some part of Kenya and Ethiopia. But we've got two ways we could go here. We could go, well, were there gods walking amongst men? Which, very famous best-selling book tells us from a long time ago. And we've got the Enoch story about the angels and the chords and all of that. And the Ezekiel with his flying machine and
the wheels within wheels.
The wheels within wheels. And I mean, by heck, there's plenty of it. But I think to answer that, you need to talk more to somebody whose brief is... I had some questions to answer about whether these numbers and the astronomy, whether the astronomy around the Earth was a form of communication from a higher intelligence. I didn't look for that, but my brief became that quite quickly, with these triangles that solve all problems. And there's a type of circle called a flattened circle, where you can predict eclipses, and they're all over. They're in Brittany, they're everywhere. There's even examples in Sudan, you know. And so this knowledge, I think, was common.
And what was the answer? What's the conclusion you drew?
Well, the conclusion I have drawn is it's actually changed my consciousness, which I think might be part of it. That, in fact, you align yourself to something bigger than the human condition, which I suppose is true metaphysics at one point. I feel much more at home living on planet Earth with this feeling of Plato said it. He said, it's very good to believe in God. I'm doing John Michel's impression of Plato, which is how I received my Plato. He was my intermediary. John Michel was my priest to Plato. It's very good to believe in God, but if you can't believe in God, it's even better to believe that things are more perfectly managed than you could ever conceive of. And I think that's what this is all about, that the uniqueness of the Earth in space, with the moon and the sun being 400 times bigger in size, but the distance is 400 times, so that they're the same size, they make a perfect eclipse. It's almost like saying, hey guys, you know, there's some order here. And of course, cosmology is in a position where it believes that things happen in a more or less a chaotic or random fashion. But here we've got some very precise geometry and numerical order happening between the Earth, Sun and Moon system. I even wrote a book about the Earth, Sun and the Moon system based on that, because they are locked in certain harmonies, and John Martineau has been doing it with Venus and other arrangements for years. We live in a rather, if it didn't happen by accident, and therefore that leads to a bigger question that I'm not qualified to answer, but I'm perfectly comfortable working with this material, knowing that it seems to me that there is an organisation behind it, that doesn't really matter whether it was aliens or whether it was a lost civilization. That's very interesting, but what lies at the root of that is this organising force, which we've always called God in our human experience, or goddess, or it doesn't really need to have a gender assignment to it. That's where I am, and I'm very happy with that. I've done 20 odd years of this now, and I'm reaching a point now where I'm starting to think about the longer term implications of what my work has done for me. It's a very personal journey, and therefore probably not of a lot of interest to other people. But the books that have come along the way, I think, are my milestones that have been written to try and guide people into the space that I've had to go in, particularly the biography of Alexander Thom, which I had the privilege of writing with the help of the family, where I actually relived his journey and saw the limitations of being a professor who was doing this stuff in the era before the era we live in, and the restrictions placed on him and his terrible limitations that he had himself because of his generation. And you realise that, you know, we are now able to think outside the box more easily. And I don't know where I'll be going. I don't know where this is going to lead now. My brother and I are working together on sites in Brittany and here in the Lake District and in Scotland. You know, he is the Matrix of Creation web is the thing to Google there, and he writes loads of stuff, and we work together, and that's good because, yeah, can I make this point? I know it's going to make me some enemies, but in the Earth Mysteries movement, you put two people together at a conference and leave them in the same room for more than 10 minutes and they're fighting. There's been no peer assessment of material within the movement. Everyone is discovering stuff so fast, and often legitimately, that they are just too busy to worry about what other people are doing. I mean, I know Alan Butler and Chris Knight have been doing this stuff because I know Bob Lomas, who was a common accomplice with them, and you know, and all the Paul Devereux and all that lot from the Lay Hunter, and none of them speak to each other, and we ought to really. I mean, I know Bob Lomas because I used to work with him in the electronics industry. There's a coincidence.
Oh, really?
You see.
Okay.
Yeah. So Bob and I shared an office for 2 years, which is quite interesting. So there we have a situation that needs to change, and because my brother and I can tell each other to F off, and that's crap what you've just written, because we're brothers and our history goes back further than just the subject, we are able to critique our own work.
Very
I
useful.
have to say that my wife's very good at that. She says, you're on a rant there, stop that. You have to take that rude word out there. And so editing and peer group stuff is absolutely essential. And it leads me to the final point on this, and I am having a bit of a rant here. There's no magazine, there's no group that encompasses this holism of geometry, landscape art. Well, you can list them from what we've just been talking about. There's no way. Megalithomania is a way of doing that. But in my way of thinking, there needs to be a little bit more critiquing of work and honesty about that, because I've written some pretty honking stuff in my time, and I've been grateful for people saying it's rubbish or you've not thought this through. And there's some brilliant work that can't get published because the person doesn't know how to do it. I get sent stuff, and most of it isn't very good, and some of it is brilliant.
So some sort of crucible by which...
Yeah, well, it needs a holding vessel. That's exactly what a crucible is, yes. And I think that if I was... The one thing that would make this work better would be if that was set up. If there was a scheme whereby all the researchers could get together and not come and... This is my work, this is what I've done, and then for an hour, and then disappear, listen to perhaps two more, but can't take it all in. But these people actually need to spend more time together in the same environment, rather like archaeologists all meet up, or teachers, or any other profession meet up, so they can just sort of have a beer and talk about what they're doing. Yeah. Maths does this brilliantly well. If you're a mathematician, I used to do some lectures for the Royal Society of Mathematics, and they really do that well. They send people who are involved in maths for a weekend in some nice place, and you can save years of work because someone's already done it, or they fight like cats in a bag, you know. Well, archaeologists fight like cats in a bag. I mean, it's human, it's what we do. Our egos are enormous, and, you know, if you think you're onto something, you're going to take anybody else's view happily. You know, it's just human. I'm sorry, that's what happens.
Just to wind up, we are, as was ever inexorably the case, finally in the hallowed year of 2012.
Yeah, yeah.
And we are lurching toward the fateful date of
the winter solstice.
The winter solstice. Yes. Assuming we aren't all blown to smithereens, what do you see for 2013 and beyond?
I've been a bit of an eco person for 40, 50 years.
Yeah, me too.
So the party is clearly over, isn't it, with the economic thing? There's some serious, because I'm also fluent in astrology, we've got the same thing in the sky, the same vibe as we had in the 60s, which is Uranus and Pluto in square. Now, sounds bonkers to anyone who isn't, but you know, you can see it everywhere. The Arab Spring is a classic manifestation of it. So there is an opportunity for big change. Indeed, you know, the last American president used it as his slogan. Yes, we can, you know, change. But unless the model changes, the paradigm changes, it's very hard not to see a future where everything grinds downhill because we haven't found the new yet. The new prosperity. What is new prosperity? What is new ecology? You know, what is climate change? I mean, climate change is mired in all sorts of politics and rubbish, and it's boring, intensely boring. I mean, just use less, you know.
Use less, don't screw up your environment.
Yeah, insulate your house, move to somewhere smaller, you know. But it's not possible for everyone to do that. But I think that 2013, people will wake up on the 22nd of December, and they might have had during this year, because of losing their job or because of the recognition that things ain't going to be like they were, may have a transforming effect on them, which is a form of death, like the destruction of 2012. I mean, I personally was ripped out of my house last year and placed in a new house because circumstances, an opportunity arose, and it happened as fast as a near-death experience. I mean, within 2 weeks we'd bought a house that we couldn't really afford but had land with it, and And suddenly we pitched out of, and someone came along and said, can I rent your house, before we'd even put an advert in. Brilliant set of manifestations. And that was, I think that might be my 2012 moment, because I've now got all the timber I need to burn, and which is carbon neutral. I can grow my own fruit and vegetables, and I'm in the middle of the Preselias where I can do my other work without doing more than going on a push bike. And this is very nice space to be in. But it's been painful to do it, because change is painful. So 2012 maybe wake people up, but I like the cartoon. Have you seen the cartoon, where the big sun wheel cartoon? Yeah, this is going to really freak people out. Got to run out of space and had to finish in 2012. You know, so there we are. But I mean, you're taking me to South Africa, South America, and I stay here because I'm at home here in Britain.
Robin Heath, thank you very much.
It's fine. It's been lovely talking to you.
You too,
Okay.
sir.